If you look at the Strait of Hormuz today, most people ask a simple question. Is it open or is it closed? From a US policy perspective, that is the wrong question. The real issue is not closure, it is uncertainty. Because in modern energy systems, you do not need to fully shut down supply to create disruption. You only need to make it unreliable. Right now, nearly 20% of global energy supply flows through this single corridor, and roughly 3/4 of that energy is directed toward Asia, powering the industrial systems of China, Japan, and other manufacturing economies. So, when the strait becomes unstable, even briefly, it does not just affect oil prices. It begins to ripple through global supply chains, industrial output, and trade flows. And that is exactly what we are seeing. Following failed negotiations, the strait was closed, briefly reopened during a ceasefire, and then restricted again within hours. This pattern signals something more important than a temporary disruption. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer operating as a stable transit route. It is becoming structurally unpredictable. Markets are already reacting to the shift. During escalation, WTI crude moved into the $95 to $100 range, while Brent crossed above 100. When ceasefire signals appeared, prices dropped back toward the 80 to 85 range. This does not indicate stability. It reflects temporary relief within an unresolved system. From a policy standpoint, this changes behavior. The global market is no longer optimizing for cost. It is beginning to optimize for security and reliability. Countries, companies, and supply chains are now asking a different question. Not what is the cheapest energy, but what is the most reliable system under uncertainty? And before we can understand where this shift leads, whether into new supply routes, new alliances, or new market structures, we need to step back and understand something more fundamental. How did the Strait of Hormuz become this critical to begin with? This leads to three key questions. 1. How did the Strait of Hormuz become the backbone of the global energy system? 2. What happens when that system becomes unstable for both Western and Asian economies? 3. And how does uncertainty reshape the structure of global energy and trade markets? Before diving into the present-day situation, it is necessary to understand how significant the Strait of Hormuz has been within the global energy system. Since the late 1970s and into the 1980s, following the consolidation of major oil industries in countries such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and other Gulf producers, the Strait of Hormuz gradually became the primary maritime corridor for global energy trade. Over time, it evolved into a backbone of the world economy as oil became the essential fuel for transportation, logistics, and electricity generation. Although alternative routes such as the Suez Canal existed, the structure of global demand made Hormuz uniquely important. By the 1980s, global oil consumption reached approximately 60 to 65 million barrels per day, with the Middle East contributing around 18 to 22 million barrels per day, much of which was exported through Hormuz. At the same time, a growing share of demand was shifting toward Asia, where industrial economies were expanding rapidly. This shift was closely tied to broader geopolitical and economic developments. During the Cold War, industrial expansion accelerated under competing economic systems. In particular, under Ronald Reagan, the United States increased economic engagement with China, building on earlier diplomatic breakthroughs under Richard Nixon. This laid the foundation for China's later transformation into a global manufacturing hub. However, in the 1980s, China had not yet become a major oil importer. It remained largely self-sufficient, producing around 2.5 to 3 million barrels per day, roughly matching its domestic consumption. In contrast, Japan had already emerged as a dominant industrial power and represented one of the earliest examples of an energy-dependent industrial economy. By the 1980s, Japan consumed approximately 4.5 to 5 million barrels per day, while producing almost no domestic oil. This meant that nearly 100% of its energy needs were imported, with approximately 60 to 70% sourced from the Middle East, equivalent to around 3 to 3.5 million barrels per day flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. Japan's demand was driven by its export-oriented industrial model. As a close ally of the United States, it became a central pillar of the global manufacturing system, producing high-value goods such as automobiles, electronics, heavy machinery, and advanced industrial components. These industries required continuous and reliable energy supply, not only for production, but also for transportation and global distribution. As a result, Japan's industrial growth translated directly into sustained demand for Middle Eastern oil. A similar pattern developed in South Korea, though at a slightly smaller scale. During the 1980s, South Korea underwent rapid industrialization under a state-led model focused on heavy industry and exports. Its oil demand reached approximately 0.9 to 1.2 million barrels per day, with virtually no domestic production. Like Japan, South Korea relied heavily on imports, with 65 to 80% sourced from the Middle East, reinforcing the role of Hormuz as a critical supply route for industrial Asia. Although Indonesia was a significant oil producer during this period, producing around 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels per day as a member of OPEC, its production primarily served regional demand and was not sufficient to meet the rapidly expanding needs of industrial economies, such as Japan and South Korea. This created a structural supply gap. At the same time, alternative supply from the Pacific, particularly from the United States, was less capable of meeting this demand. U.S. oil production in the 1980s was relatively constrained, and transporting oil across the Pacific involved longer distances, higher logistical costs, and limited export capacity. As a result, Pacific routes were less competitive compared to Middle Eastern supply. In contrast, the Middle East offered a combination of large reserves, scalable production, and lower extraction costs, allowing it to meet rising demand efficiently. The geographic position of the Gulf, combined with established export infrastructure, made the Strait of Hormuz the most effective route for delivering energy to Asia. As a result, the Strait of Hormuz evolved from a regional maritime route into a critical global choke point. What had once been a passage for regional trade became the central artery supporting industrial growth across Asia. This transformation was driven by the convergence of low-cost, large-scale supply in the Middle East and rapidly expanding industrial demand in Asia, embedding Hormuz deeply within the structure of the modern global economy. What began as a system designed to supply Japan and South Korea has since expanded. In the present day, China has become the world's largest oil importer, with demand exceeding 15 to 16 million barrels per day, much of it sourced from the Middle East. As a result, the same route that once supported early industrial Asia now underpins the energy supply of the world's largest manufacturing economy, further amplifying the global importance of the Strait of Hormuz. However, this raises a critical question. If the Strait of Hormuz was initially shaped by the industrial rise of Japan and South Korea, and later expanded by China's emergence as a global manufacturing power, how did this route evolve into the pivotal system we see today? More importantly, how did a regional maritime corridor develop into a modern global choke point whose instability can influence prices, supply chains, and geopolitical decisions in real time? To answer this, it is necessary to shift from historical development to present-day dynamics, examining not only the scale of energy flowing through Hormuz, but also how uncertainty, logistics, and market behavior have transformed its role from a stable trade route into a critical point of vulnerability in the global energy system. As the global energy system evolved from the late 20th century into the present day, the Strait of Hormuz became increasingly central, not by coincidence, but as a result of structural alignment between supply capacity and industrial demand. Beginning in the early 1990s, Middle Eastern oil production expanded steadily, rising from approximately 18 to 20 million barrels per day in the post-Cold War period to 22 to 25 million barrels per day by the early 2000s, and reaching roughly 30 to 34 million barrels per day in recent years. This growth persisted despite major geopolitical disruptions, such as the Gulf War and the Iraq War, indicating that the region's production base was not only resilient, but also scalable under stress. This scalability is critical. The Middle East remains the only region capable of delivering large volumes of exportable oil at relatively low marginal cost, supported by high-quality reservoirs and established export infrastructure. Because a significant portion of this output is seaborne, the Strait of Hormuz naturally emerged as the primary transit corridor, embedding it deeply within the architecture of global energy flows. Over time, this transformed Hormuz from a geographic passage into a system-level dependency, where the stability of the route became as important as the availability of the resource itself. On the demand side, the center of gravity shifted decisively toward industrial Asia, particularly Japan, South Korea, and later China. These economies did not simply consume oil, they converted energy into industrial output, effectively acting as multipliers within the global system. Japan represents the earliest and most mature example of this model. By the 1990s and continuing into the present, Japan sustained oil demand in the range of 3 to 4 million barrels per day, with near total reliance on imports. Its industrial structure is centered on high-value, precision-driven manufacturing, including automotive engineering, robotics, advanced materials, and industrial machinery. These sectors require not only energy, but high reliability and continuity of supply, as disruptions translate directly into production losses and export delays. Japan's integration into Western economic systems, particularly its alliance with the United States, further reinforced its role as a core industrial node, amplifying its dependence on stable energy imports, primarily from the Middle East, via Hormuz. South Korea followed a parallel trajectory, though with a stronger emphasis on energy-intensive heavy industry and vertically integrated conglomerates. With oil demand around 2 to 2.5 million barrels per day and minimal domestic production, South Korea built its economy around sectors such as petrochemicals, steel, shipbuilding, semiconductors, and battery manufacturing. These industries are not only energy-intensive, but also deeply embedded in global supply chains, producing intermediate goods that feed into manufacturing systems worldwide. As a result, South Korea's dependence on Middle Eastern energy is not simply a matter of consumption, it is a function of its role as a supplier of critical industrial inputs. The most significant transformation, however, comes with China. In the 1980s, China remained largely self-sufficient in oil, consuming approximately 2.5 to 3 million barrels per day, supported by domestic production. Over the following decades, driven by industrial policy, foreign investment, and export-oriented growth, China expanded into the largest manufacturing hub in the world. Today, its oil demand has reached approximately 15 to 16 plus million barrels per day, with more than 10 to 12 million barrels per day imported, a substantial portion sourced from the Middle East. This shift fundamentally altered the scale and structure of global energy demand. China does not merely consume energy, it absorbs energy and converts it into a wide spectrum of goods, including machinery, electronics, industrial equipment, construction materials, and consumer products. These outputs are then distributed globally, with Europe acting as a major destination market. In this sense, China functions as a conversion hub within the global system, linking upstream energy supply to downstream consumption. This creates a tightly coupled chain. Middle Eastern energy flows through the Strait of Hormuz into Asia, where it powers industrial production, particularly in China, before being transformed into goods that are exported to global markets, including Europe. Japan and South Korea contribute to this chain by supplying high-end components, specialized materials, and advanced manufacturing technologies, reinforcing the overall system. Under stable conditions, this system operates efficiently, optimizing for cost and scale. However, under conditions of uncertainty, particularly in key transit routes such as Hormuz, the system begins to behave differently. The critical variable shifts from production cost to delivery reliability. Even if oil remains abundant in the ground, instability in transit routes increases transport risk, insurance costs, and logistical delays, effectively raising the delivered cost of energy. Recent geopolitical developments have made this dynamic more visible. Escalations involving the United States and regional actors have introduced repeated disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, including closures, partial reopenings, and renewed restrictions within short timeframes. During peak tension, oil markets reacted sharply, with WTI prices moving from the $60 to $70 range to above $90 to $100 per barrel, with occasional spikes toward higher levels, before easing back into the $80 range following temporary de-escalation signals. These movements suggest that markets are highly sensitive to perceived stability, not just physical supply. More importantly, the pattern of rapid reopening and reclosure indicates that the Strait of Hormuz is no longer functioning as a consistently reliable corridor. Instead, it has become structurally uncertain, affecting approximately 20% of global oil trade, much of which supports Asian industrial systems. The consequences extend beyond energy markets into the broader global economy. As energy costs rise and become more volatile, production costs in China increase, affecting the price and availability of manufactured goods. This pressure propagates through supply chains, influencing sectors such as industrial machinery, electronics, construction materials, and agricultural inputs, particularly fertilizers, that depend on energy-intensive processes. Europe, in particular, is highly exposed to this system. It faces a dual dependency on imported energy, including LNG used for electricity and heating, and on imported manufactured goods and industrial inputs from Asia. Unlike China, Europe does not possess the same level of manufacturing centralization in several key sectors, making it more sensitive to external cost increases. As a result, instability in the Strait of Hormuz translates into inflationary pressure, industrial cost escalation, and supply chain disruptions within European markets. What emerges is not a simple story of supply disruption, but a system-level transformation driven by uncertainty. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a choke point. It is a control point within a global network, where instability affects not only energy flows, but also industrial production, trade dynamics, and economic stability across multiple regions. This leads to the next critical question. How does uncertainty in the Strait of Hormuz propagate through Europe's economy, specifically through energy systems, industrial inputs, and global trade? And which channels generate the most significant economic impact? Before entering the discussion on LNG as the primary source of heating and electricity in Europe, it is necessary to first understand how oil continues to play a vital role in the European economic system. Although a significant portion of Europe has shifted toward renewable energy in pursuit of long-term energy independence, this transition primarily affects electricity generation and does not replace the core functions that oil performs within the system. The critical issue lies in sectors that cannot easily be electrified at scale, particularly transportation and logistics. Across Europe, oil remains the dominant energy source for trucks, maritime shipping, and aviation, which collectively form the backbone of economic movement. These systems are responsible for transporting goods across the continent, ranging from food and essential supplies to industrial materials and manufactured products. As a result, oil is not merely an energy input, but a mobility enabler that sustains the continuous operation of the European economy. This dependency becomes more significant when viewed within the context of global trade. A large share of goods consumed in Europe originates from China, which functions as the world's primary manufacturing hub. Energy flows, much of which originate from the Middle East, support industrial production in China, where they are converted into machinery, electronics, industrial components, and consumer goods. These goods are then transported to Europe through global shipping networks, after which oil-powered logistics systems distribute them across the continent. This creates a systemic chain in which energy supports manufacturing in China, manufacturing generates goods, and oil-dependent logistics distribute these goods within Europe. Within this structure, oil plays a critical role in maintaining the flow of economic activity. Consequently, disruptions in oil pricing do not remain isolated, but instead propagate across supply chains, affecting transportation costs, product pricing, and overall economic efficiency. To support this system, Europe relies on a combination of domestic and imported oil. Regional production from the North Sea, particularly from Norway and United Kingdom, provides partial stability but is insufficient to meet total demand. As a result, Europe depends heavily on imports, including supply from Middle Eastern producers such as Saudi Arabia and Iraq, which are integrated into global markets influenced by key choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz. The primary vulnerability, therefore, is not the physical availability of oil, but its price behavior under geopolitical stress. During periods of escalation, oil prices tend to rise rapidly due to increased transport risk, higher insurance costs, and supply uncertainty. For example, prices can move from approximately 90 euros per barrel to 120 euros to 150 euros under stress scenarios. Even without a complete supply disruption, such price increases generate immediate economic consequences. In a system where logistics is heavily oil-dependent, rising fuel costs translate directly into higher transportation expenses. This increases the cost of freight, distribution, and delivery across Europe. Because logistics is embedded within nearly all economic sectors, these cost increases cascade through the system, leading to higher prices for food, manufactured goods, and industrial inputs. As a result, oil functions as a transmission mechanism for inflation within the European economy. However, oil represents only one layer of Europe's energy dependency. The second, and more structurally critical layer, is natural gas, particularly in the form of LNG. Europe consumes approximately 330 to 360 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually within the European Union, with total European demand reaching around 450 to 500 billion cubic meters per year. Unlike oil, which primarily supports transportation, natural gas underpins heating, electricity generation, and industrial production, making it essential for system stability. A significant portion of this gas is imported, with Europe relying on pipeline supply from Norway and increasing volumes of LNG from global exporters such as the United States and Qatar. Since the reduction of Russian gas flows following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe has shifted toward a more flexible but more volatile LNG-based system. This transition introduces a different type of vulnerability. LNG markets are global, meaning that supply is influenced not only by regional conditions, but also by competition from other major consumers, particularly in Asia. Additionally, gas demand in Europe is highly seasonal, with consumption rising significantly during winter months. This creates a situation in which supply disruptions or price increases can have immediate and systemic effects. The role of natural gas extends further into industrial production and agriculture. Gas is a key input in fertilizer production, particularly ammonia and nitrogen-based fertilizers. As gas prices increase, fertilizer production costs rise, which can lead to reduced agricultural output and higher food prices. This establishes a direct link between energy markets and food systems. Taken together, oil and LNG form a dual-layer energy system within Europe. Oil determines the efficiency of movement and logistics, while LNG determines the stability of heating, electricity, and industrial production. Under stable conditions, this system operates efficiently. However, under conditions of geopolitical uncertainty, particularly disruptions linked to the Strait of Hormuz and broader regional conflicts, the system begins to reprice risk. The recent escalation involving Iran demonstrates how quickly instability can propagate through both oil and gas markets. Rising transport risks and uncertainty surrounding key transit routes have contributed to price increases across energy markets. In response, European countries have begun to restructure their supply chains, increasing reliance on LNG imports and strengthening alignment with transatlantic partners, particularly the United States. This shift suggests the emergence of a new market structure, in which Europe is moving away from diversified but regionally dependent energy sources toward a system more closely integrated with United States-aligned energy networks and global LNG markets. While this increases supply flexibility, it also exposes Europe to new forms of volatility tied to global competition and shipping constraints. This leads to another critical question. To what extent can United States energy exports, particularly LNG and crude, act as a stabilizing alternative to Middle Eastern supply? And how does this reshape the global energy market structure? From a structural perspective, the United States has increasingly positioned itself as an alternative energy market within the global system. As the world's largest oil producer, with output reaching approximately 13.6 million barrels per day, the United States has developed the capacity to act as a flexible supplier, particularly under conditions of global disruption. At the same time, U.S. crude exports remain significant, averaging around 4 million barrels per day, with Europe and Asia serving as its primary destination markets. This production strength is complemented by its expanding role in natural gas and LNG exports. U.S. LNG shipments have reached record levels, with exports to Europe alone rising to approximately 10.3 billion cubic feet per day in 2025, accounting for a dominant share of total U.S. LNG exports. This reflects a broader structural shift, in which Europe has increasingly relied on transatlantic energy flows to stabilize its system following earlier supply disruptions. Within this context, the United States does not operate as a fixed supplier tied to a single region, but rather as a flexible energy node, capable of redirecting flows based on market conditions, pricing, and geopolitical developments. This flexibility contrasts with the more route-dependent nature of Middle Eastern supply, which relies heavily on choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, logistical infrastructure has begun to support this emerging system. The Panama Canal, for example, has seen increasing use as an alternative route for U.S. energy exports, particularly LNG shipments, moving from the Atlantic basin toward Pacific markets. Recent data indicates that U.S. crude flows through the canal have approached 200,000 barrels per day, while LNG traffic has increased as global disruptions shift trade patterns. Additionally, the canal is operating at near full capacity, handling up to 36 to 38 vessels per day, reflecting growing demand for alternative transit routes under current conditions. This creates a secondary system of energy movement, in which the United States supplies both Europe and, increasingly, Asian markets such as Japan, South Korea, and China through transoceanic routes. While transportation costs along these routes remain higher compared to traditional Middle Eastern supply chains, demand conditions, particularly during periods of instability, have sustained these flows. In other words, even when logistics are more expensive, security and reliability begin to outweigh cost efficiency. Recent developments in the Strait of Hormuz further reinforce this shift. The strait typically handles around 20% of global oil trade, making it one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system. However, repeated disruptions and uncertainty surrounding its operational stability have led market participants to increasingly seek alternative supply routes and sources. In response, the United States has gained a stronger position within global energy markets, not by replacing Middle Eastern supply entirely, but by absorbing part of the displaced demand and providing diversification. As a result, a new market dynamic is beginning to emerge. Europe is strengthening its alignment with transatlantic energy flows, particularly through LNG imports, while Asian markets are gradually increasing engagement with U.S. supply despite higher transportation costs. This does not eliminate dependence on Middle Eastern energy, but it introduces a parallel system that reduces reliance on a single choke point. From everything we have discussed today, we can conclude that the global energy system is not defined by isolated regions, but by an integrated network connecting Asian industrial demand and European market dependency. The uncertainty surrounding the Strait of Hormuz does not simply disrupt supply. It reveals how deeply interconnected global energy flows, industrial production, and trade networks have become. What appears as a regional instability is, in reality, a system-wide signal that forces markets to adjust. This analysis suggests that emerging energy markets are not formed randomly. They are shaped by shifts in reliability, strategic alignment, and logistical adaptability. As instability increases in traditional supply routes, new market structures begin to develop, often supported by alternative supply systems and evolving geopolitical alignments. At the center of this transformation remains the Strait of Hormuz. Its importance is not defined solely by the volume of energy that passes through it, but by its role as a critical link between supply and demand across multiple regions. When that link becomes uncertain, the entire system begins to reconfigure.